Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You don't need GPS or satellite technology to tell you the first difference. I'm obviously not Minette Batters. Sadly, she wasn't able to be here, so you've got me instead. I'm Mark Pope. I'm chairman of the NFU Environment Forum. I'm also an arable farmer from near Taunton in Somerset, and the technology that we're hearing about today is something that we're using and we're looking to use ever more. As an industry, we need all these technologies because, as we've heard, we've got a growing population worldwide and within our own country, and we're going to need to produce more and at the same time impact less. And these sort of technologies we're hearing about are going to give us some of the tools to help us achieve these goals. We've got four really good speakers today who are going to talk about really tying it down to the end user this session's about. They're going to give 10-minute presentations, and then we'll draw all four of them back onto the stage at the end, and we'll try and have a question and answer session then. So without no further ado, I'd like to introduce Keith Norman, Technical Director for Velcourt, to the stage to talk about perhaps a little bit of the bigger picture. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much to the conference organisers for the invitation to speak this morning. I wanted to set off a bit of background setting at the start of my talk, because we in farming are not having a very good time at the moment. There are a lot of problems, and I think it would be quite good just to put one or two things in perspective. So the total income from farming, or TIF as it's actually abbreviated, is actually the lowest since 1998, the current commodity prices and profitability in the industry. We've got a skill shortage, we've got an ageing population. The average age of a UK farmer is 59. We've got some really big problems in terms of resistance, and that's not just in weeds but also pests and disease. And we've also now got regulation as a really big problem, with reduced choices of agrochemicals going forwards. We've just had a new bit of legislation called the endocrine disruption legislation announced on Wednesday, which is actually going to examine all current products for endocrine disruption, and if they don't reach that threshold of acceptability, they will not be reauthorized. And so, for example, in the next 12 months, there are 53 active ingredients coming up for reapproval. We also have climate change to contend with, and I've been farming for over 30 years, and in the last 5 years I've never seen so many extremes of temperature, rainfall, etc. 2012 was like a monsoon, 2013 was the big deep freeze, in 2 consecutive years, and trying to farm with those conditions is quite difficult. And on top of that, we've got volatile commodity prices. I thought I'd also put this graph up because this is actually showing the yellow bars of global production of wheat, and also that red line is the global stocks of wheat. And the stock-to-use ratio globally is the 3rd highest since 1960. So lots of stock equals low price, and that's what we're getting. So year-end stocks are about another 15 million tonnes than they were last year, and the largest on record. And if we look at the price, just to really look at the detail, here we are in 2006, here we are in 2016, so in the last 10 years we're about on the same money. But if you look at the inflation by input, that's quite sobering. And those key inputs that we have to grow a crop, seeds, ferts and sprays, the index inflation of the last 10 years, that same time period, the prices are more or less the same. There's some pretty big differences there, and also in fuel, labour and rent and interest, etc. So that's just set the background and why we need technology to really help us through this situation. So I've just listed a few of these satellite-based technologies that we're actually currently using as Velcourt. So auto steer, tractors and combines, virtually every single tractor and combine is tracked with satellite. And whether it's a cultivator, a seed drill, or a combine. We've actually found a big advantage from that, because we've got one farm that was about 2,500 hectares, and when he went over to RTK tram lining, he saved about 17 hectares of spray every time he sprayed his wheat crop, just not having overlaps to deal with. We're great fans of variable seed rate to actually change seed rate and plant population on the move, depending on soil type. So we have a lot of farms with soil maps using either earth observation soil maps or EMI field scanning. We are using variable rate nitrogen on some farms as well. We're using NDVI vegetation maps. It's an interesting, in Barbara's first talk, and where she was looking at 2012 on a global scale of NDVI, how the UK had a tinge of green to it, looking quite favourable. That was the case, but then the sun went in about now in June, the rain started, and we ended up with 5 and 6 tonne a hectare yields. So NDVI is not everything, it's one component of that yield calculation. Weed mapping and also auto boom shut-off as technologies we're using for sprayers. Crop development monitoring, and these are some images from Geosys, which it's quite nice when you're farming a big area of land to see farms, and you have a little indicator, green, amber, red kind of system in terms of NDVI on the farms. You can then zoom into between field variation, and then you can actually go within a field. So you can have a global look at your farming business if it's fragmented, and zoom in as you want to. So the main purpose of my short presentation this morning is to say, well, what else could we use in terms of earth observation technologies to either reduce costs or increase output, or both? It's interesting now that synthetic aperture radar is coming on stream, and if you look at its ability for detecting differences in soil moisture, and then you extrapolate wetter parts of fields must be heavier and possibly got more subsoil issues, then you can start looking at a differential subsoiling and cultivation pattern. And there is the technology now in the machinery to have controllers in cabs and automatic depth control that read the map of the soil moisture. So you're actually using less diesel, you're actually using less wearing parts, and you're spending the effort and the time subsoiling where the need is most acute. Another output potentially for GPR, and again soil moisture maps, is where we've got irrigation going on for potatoes particularly, less so in sugar beet. But we have been users of neutron probes, which are very accurate machine, very good at doing what they do, but they're really measuring the moisture at one small point in the field, and then you have to extrapolate from that reading. But if you actually have a soil moisture map regularly coming into the farm office through GPR, and you've got the ability to differentially apply irrigation with boom irrigation rather than hose reel, there's some real savings potentially there with water. Moving on to another area, weed pest detection. There was a question earlier on about cabbage stem flea beetle. Well, that's the adult murdering the cotyledons of an emerging rape crop, and these are the larvae that tunnel in the stem and cause the havoc in terms of reduced growth, development, branching, and massively affect yield. But there are some other really common targets here that we're having big problems with. Septoria, light leaf spot, blackgrass, brome, wheat bulb fly, yellow rust, pollen beetle. Now, as one of the previous speakers said, you can't see those from space, but you will definitely be able to see the impact from those pests and diseases and weeds from space, because they are some of our most damaging targets at the moment. We're trying to get better at spotting. So a nice little system, in my mind, is that you have regular remote crop monitoring, looking at particular wavelengths that actually identify some of the impacts on some of these weeds, pests and diseases. You get early stage detection, because it's much easier to control a problem in the early stages than in late stages. You come in with spatial intervention, and then you go back to assessment of the control that you've just implemented, and so on throughout the growing season, and you have a very good live monitoring and management program. Other possibilities, looking at Lidar, to look at crop height. What we as farmers really worry and fear is this scenario with lodging, because not only is there a yield penalty, but you have penalties in terms of protein, quality, specific weight, Hagbergs, ear diseases, mycotoxins, soil moisture. and then clearing up the mess afterwards with long stubble to try and get next crops into and volunteer control in the next crop. So if you can identify areas in the field that are growing very quickly and you can differentially apply plant growth regulation, you can avoid this situation from ever occurring. Another area that's really important is yield prediction. And this is a system that, again, geoscists are using, whereby they are actually looking back in the data archive for years that have got similar NDVI development month by month. And there are 2 years here, and this is the current year, this red one here. So there's a basic similarity of NDVI production. If you then couple on top of that and look at the back data in terms of things like temperature, rainfall, photosynthetically active radiation, and you know what the outcome of these years were that grew like this with the weather parameters that they were experiencing, you might actually get a pretty near accurate attempt to put a yield prediction on well before harvest. And if you do so, what does that mean? Well, it means that you can match your agrochemical investment and fertilizers and growth regulators to the existing crop. You can forward plan your grain storage, you'll forward plan your sales. And if you take last year as an example, that we didn't know we were going to get the record yields that we did until the combines went in the field. And it was some of the best yields we've ever had as a company. And that goes for a lot of farmers in the UK too. If you look back at prices, they were at their peak just before the combines went into the field, about £132 a hectare, per tonne. As soon as the combines went in and the global harvest was known, prices dropped, and they are still dropping, and they're sub £100 per tonne today. So knowledge of that big yield would have given you some sort of market intelligence to go out and couple into futures markets to secure a better price. There are other customers that would benefit as well, like banks, commodity buyers, etc. So with all of this technology, what are some of the barriers to uptake? Well, cost is one, and it's really, really encouraging to hear that satellite imagery a lot of it is becoming free of charge now, but there will still be a need to actually convert that imagery into something meaningful. There's also a lot of resistance to change. Farmers are very traditional. And is this a generational thing? And perhaps when the new generations start having a bigger impact in terms of farming businesses, maybe this embracement of technology will be more rapid at ground level. There is a little bit of a lack of interest in technology. There's a bit of apathy in the farming community as well. There are people, really feeling the chips are down at the moment, and they're staying down as a result of that. But we also have to look at other things like, for example, standardization of connectivity, just having controllers in a tractor cab that will physically wire up to the controller on the seed drill, the fertilizer spreader, etc. There's also conformity of data across platforms. And, we've had situations where there's been an upgrade on a controller, and then suddenly the controller stops talking to the machine on the back of it. Because that's not communicating in the same language. So harmonization of data and platform usage is really, really an essential part of it. We're also relying on networking possibilities, and there are some networking issues, especially on large farming businesses, like a lot of our managers are looking after, where there could be 30, 40 miles east to west between units that one farm manager is managing. And that's quite a common occurrence these days, and to actually get that connectivity and that networking needs to be looked at. And the biggest one here is rural connectivity and speed data transmission. I mean, our office in Stamford has still got a half a meg of broadband speed. And when everybody's in the office on a wet day, you can go and make a cup of coffee and, to send an email. It's still dreadful, and we need to get better at that as well. And there is also a little bit of data security risk as well, that some people are saying, that's my data, I don't want anybody else to see it or have access to it. So they're all the sort of barriers that we need to overcome. So really, just to finish, it is a very exciting new chapter. Let's all work together to make it happen. We can't all do it in isolation. There's some great science out there. There's some great analytical capability out there. We know our needs. Let's all talk together and get it sorted. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was really refreshing to hear. As I see, that we've got a lot of challenges out there as an industry, and this is one of the tools that can help us. But unfortunately, it still can't control the weather. Our next speaker today is Andrew Richards from Agrii, and he's going to talk about using environmental data to improve season management of wheat. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I feel slightly, should we say, sort of nervous and unqualified here amongst such an intellectual audience that I see, very unqualified. And having heard sort of Keith eloquently describing these sort of issues to how it is Velcourt and the opportunities with some of this new scale of farming, what I've picked out on is very much as a sort of mud-on-the-boots agronomist, is how we can use some of the sort of collected data to improve our in-season management. So rather than sort of looking at the larger picture, what I've done is sort of pick a few smaller examples, which hope will create some wider illustration. So we'll sort of quickly pick up with the yield plateau, seasonal variation in yield, and a project that we started internally within Agrii, which I work for as a large UK agronomy company, providing agronomic advice to probably 25-30% of UK farming. Trying to understand when we get these high yields, where they've come from, and the sort of better predictability, and therefore enable this matching investment that Keith talked about to make it far more appropriate rather than after the event understanding. So this was a sort of classic slide, this one that I think Bill Clark spoke at the Oxford Farming Conference in 2011, and when he was at Broom's Barn, and put up this. So the blue line at the top was the improvements, sequential improvement in genetics of UK wheat, going through national listing, and yet below the actual farm performance, lagging well below that, and probably the gap widening. Now, what were the reasons for this? Now, I see the yield plateau as a fairly self-fulfilling model. One of the things, as Keith pointed out, 2012, seasonal weather can have a far greater impact on farm performance than the incremental genetic increases. Nitrogen rates, key driver for yield. People were applying the same level of nitrogen when I started as an agronomist over 30 years ago. In many cases, they are today. So if the yield potential's gone up by 30%, we need to be adjusting nitrogen more closely with that yield potential. Farmers and agronomists, we're cautious people, and particularly worried about over-investing, and knowing that what we can often see is that the impact of heat, drought, waterlogging, and even as Keith, picked up 2012, at this stage in the year, we were reasonably optimistic, and the shock of seeing those yields and the impact it had on farm businesses that have taken maybe 2-3 years to recover from that 2012 cannot be underestimated. So too often I spend September explaining to farmers why the yields were less than they thought they were going to be or why they were more. And I say we'll pick out that 2012 year, and it's amusing that Keith's here today. I remember going to a meeting that autumn, and he was talking about their nitrogen trials, and basically they should have applied half the amount of nitrogen that year than they did. But that was an easy after the event. Bill Clark was going around talking about actually farmers should have doubled their investment in fungicides. Again, after the event doesn't really help. So with the large amount of environmental data we're now collecting, can we use this data to improve our in-season decision making rather than as an after-season analysis? So just as a sort of quick couple of examples, this was 2011 harvest, a set of variety trials that we have at our technology centre down in Wiltshire, where for the first time for many years, we saw yields over 15 tonnes a hectare. And that came from crops that were so thin that you could sort of walk between them in May. And my colleagues were saying, this site's going to be too thin to even have an open day. We'd be embarrassed to bring farmers here. And yet those yields came, wheat's ability to compensate, to make, we had some very efficient canopies that within the dry year, the smaller canopy, were able to make better use of water. And it's understanding where that yield came from and drove that started to make us look at the sort of wider project. And then similarly, that 2012 year, following up with Keith, this was a series of nitrogen trials that we did that year. And as you can see that on the left-hand side, the 150 kilos of nitrogen in various formats provided the highest yield, and the worst thing you could do was increase nitrogen. And at 320, the yields were dropping substantially. And that's probably the first time in my career as an agronomist season where we've seen a negative nitrogen response curve. So we then, picking up on what Bill Clark had sort of driven this and various other people talking about this yield plateau and the Rothamsted 2020 wheat project, within the company we set out Project Best of British Wheat and looking to hit sort of 15-ton challenge. And really what I want to pick out on today, these are some of the factors that we felt we needed to look at within that project to enable a more programmed approach to growing wheat and a more greater confidence and picking out the sort of weaknesses in our approach to agronomy so that we could sort of start to bridge that yield gap. And one of the key points was improving this predictability of outcome rather than explaining away outcomes post-harvest. Now, one of the things that we did was to, we had a conference up at Nottingham University in January 2014. And one of the people that came along, Roger Sylvester Bradley, from ADAS, and using some of his information here. Historically, we tend to think about wheat, and particularly we were looking then at the world record crop that was held by Mike Slary in New Zealand. And you tend to think of, where did he get his 15 tonnes from? 500 ears per square metre, 50 grains per ear, 50,000 grain weight. That's what Roger did, and was actually sort of break that down into a sort of more physical component. That the 15 tonnes of wheat came from 50 terajoules per hectare of solar radiation, 600, it was in, you can't see it, milliliters of water in season, and then obviously nutrients matched to that yield. Now, below that line, you've got the UK. We've got only 30 to 40 terajoules of solar radiation, so already at a disadvantage to that New Zealand. And if we're going to sort of push the yield, we've actually got to think, how can we use light in a more efficient way? And we've been working with Eric Murchie at Nottingham University, who's done a lot of work on canopy, rather than looking at individual plant, canopy reflectance and ability to make best use of solar energy. Water. 40% of UK wheat is grown on drought-prone soils. In New Zealand, where they were getting these records, they got that capability of irrigation. Whereas in the UK, we're not getting the in-season rainfall to grow 15 tonnes, so we've got to look at how we can mitigate against that drought and build water reserves into the soil, higher organic matter, so that we can ride through those dry periods. And then nutrition, which again is sort of a more complicated area, and obviously you're going to hear more about things like nitrogen and canopy, but certainly a lot of the work we've done about understanding the sort of wider interactions of nutrients. And a lot of that work has sort of been parked sort of 30, 40 years ago, and we've really got to relook at that and the interrelationship. So we did manage to start pulling these things together, and particularly I was pleased about the work I've been involved in nutrition. And many of you will have seen, got quite a lot of publicity, one of our growers that we were involved in agronomy who sort of picked up on this sort of 15-ton challenge, Oz Smith up in Northumberland. We broke the world wheat record with 16.52 tonnes per hectare, so this last year, getting a tonne a hectare more than Mike Slary in New Zealand. And it wasn't just a sort of one-off. We're down in Dorset. Another of my colleagues working on the same sort of programme. We've got so 16 tonnes of Skyfall milling wheat down near Weymouth. So certainly showing the real capability that UK is capable of producing this wheat. Now, as Keith was saying, is this just a sort of shock of the season? Had we known this? Now, what we're starting to do, sort of picking up on what Roger was talking about, starting to think of wheat in these sort of physical components. One of the things we have is a national network of weather stations. So the picture on the left is an ADCOM weather station. We've got 150 of these dotted across the country, where we're looking at rainfall, wind speed, but critically solar radiation. And then on the right-hand side is a picture of one of our Neutron soil moisture probes. Now, as with Keith, originally we were looking at these for creating irrigation schedules, and particularly important in sort of water use and sort of limitation on those high-value crops. And a number of you may have seen there was a very interesting article in last Friday's Economist about an American guy and other areas of using a sort of smart approach to water, nutrient use, as well as going on to some of the other things that we're talking about today. So how did we predict that yield? Now, one of the things is looking at the temperature. Now, within wheat production, what you have is that each phase of production is governed by temperature. So that you have so many day degrees in a particular phase of crop, and then the level of activity within that phase depends on solar radiation. And certainly up at Berwick-upon-Tweed, where the world record crop was, what was particularly interesting was the temperature we were sort of monitoring, and we were over a degree colder last year, mean temperature. And of particular value was that sort of cold period in March. Now, we had a cold period this year in that sort of tillering phase when the embryo is forming, but this year it was cold and wet, whereas last year it was cold and bright. So we were able to see the high levels of solar radiation coupled with that low temperature. The other areas I draw on the right-hand side, you'll see those low temperatures in that sort of middle blue section in August during grain fill. One of the big problems we have in southern England is we get these sort of high, sort of hot evenings. So in that grain fill period, so the crop's working all day to fill the grain, and then it ends up respiring during the evening, losing some of that. Whereas up in Northumberland last summer, it was pretty miserably cold, with temperature regularly getting down to sort of 4 and 5 degrees and 2 degrees in August. I was trying to get a picture of Rod on the beach with a barbecue in his sort of duvet jacket, as a good illustration of that. And then the other factor there, the rainfall during that growing season, was very similar last year. Now that's despite the fact that when we start looking at solar radiation at Berwick, the yellow line underneath is 2014, and we're looking at this accumulated solar radiation in the season. And you can see the sort of 2015, we're tracking now something like sort of 15 to 20% ahead of it. And whereas if you'd looked at sunlight, which is what people historically looked at, and sort of quality of sunlight, that would have just shown it to be an average year. Whereas effective solar radiation is a very much more useful indice. Then we come to this sort of grain fill period. And as I was saying, the sort of temperature critical in combination with radiation. So in 2015 up in Berwick, the days to 7 to 30 day degrees, that period of grain fill, was 53 compared to 50 the year before. But also up in Berwick, they didn't have any of those warmer days. Temperature getting above 25 degrees, wheat starting to sort of shut down, not filling. So effectively, they had 4 more days of grain fill period there, coupled with that greater level of solar radiation. And as you can see, those rather miserable nighttime temperatures. As regards moisture, so we've been looking at the moisture probes, in this case, of how much available moisture is there to the crop to indicate our level of investment, rather than actually looking to at what points we need to irrigate. So on the left-hand side, we have the, you can see in sort of 2015, that was a very dry period in the section I picked up here, which is that sort of critical period prior to grain fill starting, so just prior to that flowering period. If a crop hits a drought and under moisture stress at that period, it can do quite harms to its potential yield. And you can see that although we didn't have much rain, that the line is only just dropping below that dark blue, which is the sort of point where you might thinking of irrigating on a higher value crop. And you compare that to sort of 2014, you can see at the bottom line where you get rainfall events goes up, and it probably actually was laying a bit on the wet side. So that's, as Keith was saying, and you've got those 2 points that we had with just a single moisture probe. How can we make better use of that when we've actually got some big variation in yields? So this is actually the Soil Quest, our soil conductivity map for that field where this world record yield was grown. And actually we really want to be able to perhaps understand more at a subfield level what the moisture availability is, what the yield potential is at those subfield points. So is that going to be moving forward? Do we need to be developing a model around using point source data and then how to model that within soil change? Or will sensors come down to such a point rather than these expensive several £1,000 neutron moisture sensors that we could have some sort of disposable sensors and have enough of them in the field to build a picture? So just sort of in conclusion, a sort of few learning points here. Certainly this sort of project has illustrated we can move through the yield plateau. and using environmental data to give us confidence as to how we manage and where we push our inputs and where we actually feel we've got a restriction. Certainly the UK, as we've seen this last year, is capable of delivering yields at world record levels from Dorset to Northumberland. But with this increasing number of longer, more intense weather events, we're likely to see greater yield variation, which we need to learn how to manage and mitigate. Solar radiation, critical, and our understanding of that at different points in the crop cycle, and better management of canopy, given that the UK is always going to be behind in terms of its solar radiation compared to other parts of the world, and how we can make best use of light. Although we can do nothing about temperature, we can certainly mitigate by soil moisture and working to improve moisture holding capacity of our soils. And moving forwards, we need to be using historic data of yield sets, yield potential for the year, and then using environmental data to monitor any impacts of changes for this in-season yield potential and adjusting our management and resources into that crop. And then just to quite finally finish, where are we on the curve this year? Before the grain price sort of leaps up to try and encourage it, I would say this, that unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be breaking yield records this year. This is the accumulated solar radiation up in Berwick at Rod's Farm up until last week. And as you can see on the sort of the light blue line at the bottom there, that's this year's data. We're sort of probably, in terms of accumulated solar radiation this spring, around about 15 to 20% below where we were at this stage last year. So on that note, if I could finish, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next speaker is Sergio Moreno Rojas of G Growers, and he's going to talk a bit about salad and vegetable crop monitoring using remote sensing. Thank you.
Right, thank you. First thing I would like to say, it's a pleasure to be here in the Royal Society for the first time as a speaker. And my name is Sergio Moreno Rojas. I come from Spain, as you can see from the accent. I work as a remote sensing technologist at G Growers. For those ones who don't know, G Growers basically is one of the Europe's leading fresh produce in right now, based in Cambridgeshire. We farm across not just in UK, where we are based, as well abroad in other countries such as Czech Republic, Poland, Senegal. But our main area is the southeast of Spain. What I'm in charge at G Growers is to run a remote sensing project, which we have called Agrii. And we set it up 2 years ago in collaboration with Cranfield University. So that we got an academic partner to get the expertise. Because as you can imagine, based on all this geographical spread of our business, we got different interest on Earth observation technology and what that information can offer to us. So that was the reason why we started looking at this new trend of drones, what they actually could offer to us, what were the limitations on how to operate them, should we integrate them into our internally and into our business, should we do it externally. So we contacted different suppliers, like at that time, Ursula Agriculture or others, looking at, arranging demonstrations in our fields, so gathering all that experience, and then, we made a decision saying, okay, should we invest on this? So we decided to take a different route instead. So in 2015, and the growing season that is currently ongoing, we wanted to make use of a very light aircraft instead. So it's a manned aircraft. It's the very light, it's the lightest category that you can commercially fly nowadays, because we consider it could be more cost effective compared to drones when you are up to scale the whole system up. So the idea was to demonstrate that we could actually do the same, provide the same service to all of our growers across the business, and do provide the same products and outputs as drones were doing. And the second leg of the project over there was to undertake a commercial study using satellite imagery as well. So this light aircraft, which you can see here on the bottom right, is could be 2 men, but it's one man piloted, and it allows us to cover. You have here a map of some of our land bank. So we managed to prove our commitment of covering all our area, covering more than 4,000 hectares in a very cost-effective way, being able to have that flexibility in the payload to change the sensors and that we need from an end user perspective, which is us. So you can imagine that the first product we were looking at and the most robust is the famous Vegetation Index maps. So the first thing was to prove and that this system was working fine, because this company was just starting to build up and learning how to fly and actually to do the aerial photogrammetry. So first thing to do was to go with our agronomists to see what was actually matching, trying to prove the value of this and to show what these colorful maps can provide in terms of information to them. So they can go and walk in a daily basis with the grower to the field and assess, all the, using this as a scouting tool straight away to address different issues on the fields. One of our main products are Iceberg Lettuces in terms of volume. So, all these growers are, when you go and see them to their sites, they are quite skeptical about what are these colorful maps. So you have to prove them and translate, all these colorful values into fresh weights, pounds, and you have to measure, and then you can manage things in general, right? So basically setting up trials over, in this case, specific features on the ground, what we call locally rodents, which are all river streams that they have a poor fertility. So that's how we actually were showing the growers what we could actually do with this, but not just using the very light aircraft. There are other sort of data sets that we were looking at as well. The Environmental Agency suddenly decided to release open Lidar data. So these rodents, because the erosion on these areas work in a specific way, the rodents are a bit high on the ground in terms of height. So you can extract these poor fertility areas using free open data from Lidar and maybe target those areas to add organic amends, for example, and try to rise the fertility of those areas and get a more even crop. So we can provide our customers like, Tesco, M&S, a better product and actually be, basically raise the yield in those fields. So the growers say, okay, we're going to use these maps. Should we start using precision farming in the way we usually do? Just maybe try and go and, okay, yeah, it makes some effect, but we actually have to measure it. So my team and myself, we go with the GPS and we try to set up those trial plots and to provide those measurements so we can scientifically and with numbers show the improvements, and then they will engage more with all this technology, because that's the idea, to consume all this information and Earth observations data and make most of it. So apart from the vegetation maps that are very good, some of the farmers, surprisingly, they were not interested in those. For example, some of them, they got very rich land with a very high content in organic matter. So there was a bit misleading in terms of the readings of, for example, the vegetation maps because of the weed pressure. But they were interested in plant counting, so knowing how much product available is on the ground. So in collaboration with Cranfield University, again, we have developed internally a plant count application and for sizing as well, for every transplanted crop for now. So there is an example of an aerial imagery at 1,000 feet from our platform, and then they translated the process data looking at a snapshot of, in this case, lettuce, but we have proved it to be working on celery and in potatoes as well. So not just counting the population on how much product is available once it's established compared to how much product was coming from the nursery, which gives a higher accuracy in terms of the figures. Because it's difficult to know, to be honest, how much is planted when you got huge amount of, big amount of volume. So then the sizing comes up over here in terms of how the ground area covered by the crop, and looking at assessing the greenness of that area. So within just the same batch, which is supposed to be an homogeneous crop of the same planting date, same conditions, the establishment is different. So you can expect different frame sizes to get different frame sizes at harvest, because different customers, they request different specifications for the product. So Tesco wants, bigger lettuces, or wants a bit smaller. So building a model to predict those frame sizes at the end, so that means quality product, not just amount of product, is a very valuable information for the business, for example. And even just with the NDVA maps, harvesting teams, they are using it straight away, saying, okay, we can expect different quality in this product quality in different areas, trying to allocate specific products for those areas. So trying to maximize the yield as well. Celery hearts for this poor area, longer sticks for celery in the better area, etc. Deploying the labor in a different way, saving money and time. And the second leg of the project I wanted to show is our interest in looking, in this case in Spain, where you don't have that much cloud cover for optical imagery. Of course, you combine it with radar in the UK, that could be an option, or even here, was looking at, what can we actually do the same thing using, as we were doing with the aircraft, but in a larger scale in Spain. So yeah, we established a second leg of the project, looking at from October 2015 to May this year, if we can actually monitor our crops over there. So this is our land bank in Murcia, in the southeast of Spain, looking at if we were able to identify crops, the growth stages, and our cropping area as well. What we can actually do and monitor. Can we see if the drip irrigation is, as well in some of the fields, is not working well? So all those sort of questions, just having a look, and through Airbus Defence and Space as the supplier, and and that's mainly the whole work that we have been doing right now. So we are, as a business, we got the will and resources for consuming all this data and information, and we are quite hungry to see if we can start building more and more applications. That has to be always end user driven. That's why myself and my team are building, I think, that bridge between companies like Velcourt or others and the final end user, which are the growers. So thank you very much, and open to questions.
Thank you. And our final speaker today is David Gardner for Innovation for Agriculture. And David's going to talk about opportunities and future potential for satellite and sensor technologies in the livestock area.
They got me up. Well done. Right, thank you. And thank you once again for the invitation to come and speak to you today. Innovation for Agriculture is a new organisation. We're a consortium of 15 agricultural societies really doing tech stuff for farmers. And at the moment we have two significant work streams. One of those is on precision livestock farming, and the other one is on soils. So today's event really brings those two subjects together. Precision livestock farming has lagged behind the arable sector, really lagged quite significantly behind the arable sector, but it is fast catching up. And at the moment the sort of technologies we are using is small sensors in, on and around animals to pick up what they're doing in terms of behaviour, or if they're not fit. So things like temperature sensors in the ear, microphones in poultry houses that will pick up distress, movement sensors on dairy cows that pick up estrus, and so on. The satellite stuff hasn't really arrived in the animal sector yet, but there are a number of organisations who are looking at that. And what I want to talk specifically today about really is measuring grass yields in real time in terms of the ability to do that. Grass is the country's biggest crop. It's economically hugely important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But of course it encompasses everything from rough moorland through to haylage for racehorses. So it's a very broad crop in terms of its different uses and so on. But I want to start really by suggesting that there is a cultural problem with grass, and I don't mean cultural as in agriculture, I mean culture in terms of people's attitudes or farmers' attitudes towards it. It doesn't get the level of management attention that arable crops get, and it doesn't get the attention to detail that other crops get. And indeed we know of farmers who do all the precision stuff on their arable crops, but when it comes to grass, they just don't bother. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think the first one is that grassland farmers, forage crop farmers, tend to be more focused on their animals rather than their crops. I think there's also an issue associated with the fact that they're not cash crops, they're processed by animals, or they're usually not cash crops, they're processed by animals before they turn into pound notes. And I think the third reason is it is difficult to measure, and it suffers from the concept of if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Economically, it is hugely important. A recent study by CAFRE estimated that grazed grass in terms of total cost, so the sort of full academic exercise including inputted rents and farmers' labour and so on, grazed grass costs £110 per tonne of dry matter, silage grass costs £140 a tonne of dry matter, but purchase feeds cost £230 a tonne. So there's a huge economic incentive for farmers to grow grass better and utilise it better, and it is a major driver in terms of profitability on the arable farm. And indeed, if you were to take, say, an organic clover lay, something pretty similar to what we have got in the picture there, if it's well managed and well grazed, it has the potential to be very, very productive, but effectively its annual cost, its cash cost, is zero. The farmer gets it for free, and if he can do that extremely well, he can substitute grass for purchase forage and really make quite a difference. Now, grass is difficult to measure. It's even difficult to measure in terms of yield per field. It's okay if you're making bales, they're reasonably easy to count. We can do that. Much more difficult in terms of grazed grass and trying to measure that, but we can do that, and enthusiasts do it, and they use something called a plate meter, which is more or less what it looks like there. It sits on the grass, and how high it sits above the grass offers some sort of measurement in terms of the amount of grass, amount of bulk underneath it. But it involves walking around the fields and actually taking measurements. Some of the more sophisticated ones can beam the measurement back to the farm office. But it's time consuming if you've got a small area of grass. But some of the big graziers now are into hundreds and hundreds of cows and hundreds of acres, and it has to be done laboriously. So it can be done, but it's laborious. Really quite difficult in terms of the foraging operation. In the past, I've tried weighing trailers. You would be amazed how much variability there is in the weight of a silage trailer when they look identical. That didn't really work for us. I have done it in the past by sort of measuring bits of swath and weighing it, literally with a set of scales, but it's really quite difficult to do it on an individual field basis, never mind starting to work out variability within the field. So the Kingshay Farming Trust down in the southwest, they're based in Somerset, they are looking at the potential to use Earth observation to measure grass yields. And I know, as a result of being here, I know there are a couple of other organisations looking at exactly the same thing to be able to predict the future availability of grass. And they're looking at not just yield, but also quality. And predict the future availability of grass, and then match that up to the demands of the cows as we go forward. And you see a graph here whereby they measure it on the individual fields. They know where the grass has got to be in terms of the future demand, and if there's excess grass, they will take it out to make it into silage, and if there's a shortage of grass, they can see it coming and can act accordingly. So the opportunity really to get beyond this situation of if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I think the other area that would represent a real opportunity is when farmers are developing new techniques and doing things differently. And we're seeing that happen in the grazing sector right now. This is something called mob grazing. It's a technique that's really been introduced, actually largely by a handful of Nuffield scholars who have picked it up from the United States. It breaks every rule of grazing grass that I was ever taught, and it seeks to mimic the performance of the large grazing herds on the sort of prairies and savannas, where they graze very, very, very quickly. They graze mature grass, graze it very quickly, and they trample a fair bit of the grass into the dirt. It has a reputation for building soil organic matter very, very quickly, at a rate of 1% per year. And so in terms of adopting that sort of practice, if you had the ability to measure grass, it would make it much, much easier, particularly for new adopters, to take the thing on board and understand what they're trying to do. I then want to move on and talk about variability within the field. This actually is a combine harvester map, mapping areas of high yield, areas of low yield. And I think the opportunity associated with being able to map yields spatially is huge. Farmers are very good at producing these maps. They're very good at doing very, very little with them. And I think there's a real opportunity. In my view, the successful farmer of the future is going to be the guy who can manage, who can measure variability that he can subsequently manage. And I would suggest that we shouldn't view this as a yield map. We should view it as a soil productivity map. And we should be inquisitive about why some bits yield well and some bits are poor. And we know that some bits are always good, some bits are always poor, some bits are very variable from year to year. We do know that there's a correlation between soil organic matter and yield. We don't know which one drives which one, whether soil organic matter is high because the yields are high or vice versa. But there's variability across the field, and it's driven by a number of factors. Some of them we can't influence. We can't influence the aspect and topography of the field. We can't realistically influence the sort of basic mineral makeup of the soil. We're very good at sort of trying to influence pH, P and K, but I would suggest there's a real opportunity for the inquisitive farmer to get out there and start looking at things like soil organic matter levels in the field, the ability of the field to drain at different times of the year, and try and improve the poorer areas of the field and bring their productivity up. Now, I do know that Dick Godwin did do some of this experimentally in the grassland sector. They used GPS, a combination of GPS and load cell sensors on trailers to produce maps like this. They found quite significant yield differences across a grass field, from about 26 tonnes per hectare of material through to about 35. So potentially a significant prize if just by careful management you can improve the poorer parts of the field. And I'm thinking of techniques like small bits of drainage being put in and perhaps variably spreading manure to try and lift the quality of the soil in the poorer areas. I think that represents a significant opportunity. I just want to finish by talking quickly about controlled traffic farming, which we haven't really heard mentioned today other than in very brief passing. Controlled traffic farming, it doesn't involve earth observation, but it does involve the use of satellites and looking after the soil. And the concept of controlled traffic farming is you set your farm up with a fleet of machines that are all exactly the same width, and using GPS, you ensure that the wheels always run in exactly the same track. And our heavy machines and our tyres do an enormous amount of damage to the soil. They just physically squash it, they kill the biology that lives within it, they damage its ability to drain. We know, from the work that Dick has done, that 80% of the damage is done by the first wheeling. And we also know, again from Dick's work, that in a typical arable field, in excess of 80% of the field gets a wheel over it at some point of the season if you just don't control the wheelings at all. I would suggest that in a typical grassland field that is cut 3 or 4 times for silage, the whole field will get a wheel over it at some point in the growing season. And grassland farmers tend to be less sensitive about their tyre technology and how they manage their tyre pressures than arable farmers. But we do know that compaction depresses yield in grass. That's almost a statement of the obvious, really. It depresses yields in grass, and I think with some of the machinery that is available today, there is the opportunity to introduce controlled traffic systems into grassland farming, including the rakes, the mowers, the rakes that bring it back together, and then finally into the forage harvesters that pick it up. And you see here, I started off by talking about the fact there's a cultural problem in terms of farmers' attitudes towards their grass crops. This is a photograph from Mason-Dixon Farms in the United States, and there is a picture of a farmer who loves his soil. That trailer rig is produced in their own workshops. They put it together themselves. They are thinking compaction. They are thinking about how they're managing their soils to maximise productivity. And I think some of the new technologies that are coming along, the ability to measure stuff, the ability to control where vehicles go, offer the opportunity to really get farmers to change their culture and start to treat grass as a much more serious crop, and then drive that through in terms of the total profitability of the farm. Thanks very much.